I'm Sharla and welcome to my craft room. This is the final video for the Louisburgh Community TV Knit-along challenge, and I really hope that you've enjoyed joining in and knitting your squares, and thank you so much for taking part. If you've completed every square, you should now have 12. In this video I shall hopefully give you some ideas of what you can do with your squares next. But the first thing to do is block your squares. Now, blocking is a process of wetting or steaming your final pieces of knitting to set the finished size and even out the stitches. So let's get blocking. Right, so blocking, what that means really is that you make all your squares that get all the same size really. Some of them you might feel are a bit warped, like at the side, depending on the stitch that we've made. So there's lots of different ways of blocking. So I'm just going to show you the way that I use. What I use is one of these floor mats. It's a spongy sort of floor mat. It's probably about 1 centimetre thick. So the first thing you need is the tea towel, and you need to dampen it, so it should all be wet, and then I put it over on my mat. And the other thing you need is some pins, and then what I would do is, out of all the squares that we've done, so you'll find that some are bigger than others. The aim is to try and get all the squares the same size really. So what I would do is go through all of your squares first and find the one that's the biggest. So out of all the squares, I found that the garter stitch one was the biggest. So that's the one that we'll try and make all the others the same size as. And the idea is that you pull out the corners to make a to straighten the square, if you like, and then use your pins and just pin each corner first. Now you don't want to stretch it too much. Just to make it all one size really. Now what you do next is find your next square, and you put it fairly close to the first one and just pin each corner close to where the other one is. So you don't want to overstretch it, because these are the largest squares out of all of the squares you've made. Actually, if you've got a tea towel with the lines on them, it's quite handy just to help. It's not a precision thing, it's just so that they all end up the same sort of size. And as I said before, there's lots of different ways of blocking. You can do it steaming with an iron, but this is just the way that I prefer to do it. I'll show you on one of these which is a bit curly, something like the kiss square that we did. Because it's stocking stitch, it tends to roll at one end. So the idea would be that you get the one corner and match it up with that one. And then do the same with this. And then, especially as I said, on these ones where the edges curl, you want to, I'd put several pins down the edge, like uncurl it. Okay, and then you can go across the top as well. These will need a few more pins just to keep them in place. And I tend to use the pins that have got coloured heads on. just because I find they're easier to see. Once you're unpinning again, you don't lose sight of all the pins, and especially when I'm making clothes, I don't want to leave a pin in there to give to somebody. And it's sort of one of the last things that you do really when you've been knitting, and it's something that not everybody does, and depending on the type of garment that you're making, you don't have to block it, but I tend to block my work now. I just think it looks a bit neater. Depending on how many of these, if you've got a block or a towel, how many you can do in one go. Just continue now and pin out on the damp tea towel as many as you can. So there we go, I've finished pinning out all of our squares, and I just tend to get the threads to each square neatly onto each square. There we go. So now this is the bit, the waiting game really. So all you need to do now is just leave them, and I would just put another damp towel over the top actually, like so. Just cover them up like that, and then you just obviously be careful of the pins, and I leave that for a day and we'll come back and see what they're like. So we've had nearly 24 hours, they've been pinned out, so, and the tea towel's just about dry now, so you can just unveil them again and then unpin them. So there we go, we've got a pile of 12 squares, more or less the same size as each other now, and next we're going to decide what to do with them. Now if you're not going to be using your squares for our Louisburgh community blanket, you've got 12 squares now, and you've got to decide what to do with them. You may already have got in your mind a nice idea of what you'd like to do. The first thing to do really is to put them out, spread them out on a surface and have a look at the different patterns and colours that you've used, and then decide where you're going to place each square. Okay, so there's our 12 squares. Now you can see some of them are fairly similar to each other, as in the moss stitch and the garter stitch, and then there's the garter stitch stripe. So you may decide, well actually I don't want all of those together, I might split them up a bit. You've got a couple of patterns like these two here. These two here are fairly similar as well, as are the Eiffel Tower and the bricks. So you just need to decide, right, where do I want? Now the heart, you see, I would probably put in the middle somewhere. Swap those two round. It's just a bit of puzzle. If you like puzzles, you'll love this. Now once you've blocked all your squares, there's several things that you can do with them. The first thing would be to make your own little blanket, because there's 12 lovely squares here, and I don't see why you couldn't make it as a nice little blanket for maybe a baby or toddler. Now you can either sew each square together using a similar colour as the yarn and using your ends that you've got left over from each square. If you're somebody that crochets, you could decide to join them together by crocheting just a very thin line of crochet in between each square and then in between each row, and you could do that in a similar colour or in a contrasting colour. So first of all, yes, you've got 12 squares, you can make it into a blanket. The other thing, if you haven't done 12 squares, so say you've done 4 squares, so maybe you've done these 4 squares Well, again, you could sew them together, or you could do a little border around each square and then crochet or sew them together. And you could make it into a cushion cover. So you could make this the front of the cushion cover, and then you could either get some material, some fabric, and put it on the back of the four, or if you wanted to, you could knit a giant square in one plain colour, and one of the patterns that we've done, just make it a larger one and put that on the back. Again, if you've done 8 squares, you could do the front and the back of the cushion. Another thing you could do if you've got 8 squares is, again, make 2 separate larger squares. So that's one square, that's another. Sew them together or crochet them together, whichever you prefer. Then what you could do, if you're somebody that likes sewing, you could make a similar size, get a similar size square of fabric, or 2 squares, sew it together around 3 sides, and make it into a bag. So that could be, the fabric could be the lining to your bag, and this could be the outside of your bag. Of course, if you've only done a few squares, it might be, say if you did just the heart or one of these nice ribbed squares, you could make that the main focus point for something else. So if you'd just done 1 square, you could then add to it. So there's loads of things that you can do with these squares. Now, if you want to make it into a larger blanket, then you will need to do some extra squares if you're keeping your squares to make into a blanket yourself. So you will need to make extra squares if you're wanting a larger blanket. But I will tell you now how you can get involved in the knit along blanket for Louisburgh TV. So there we go, we've got our lovely 12 squares all neat and tidy now. Now, when I started this knit along challenge, the intention was to collect all the squares at the end and connect them together to make 1 or more blankets, depending on how many squares we got. Now, I realise many people watching this video and joining in may not live near Louisburgh, may not even live in the same country, and therefore may want to make their own blanket, and that's great. I hope it's given you a great community project to join in. If, however, you do want to be part of the final knitted Louisburgh piece, and I'm going to call it a piece of art, a big blanket or whatever we decide to do, then this is what you need to do. Firstly, I should say, I don't mind how many squares you contribute. It can be 1 square or 100 squares. It will all be gratefully received and used in the final piece. Now, it would be great if you could block your squares, and ideally they need to be 15 centimetres or 6¼ inches square, but please don't worry if they're not that accurate. Now, the plan is, during July, I'm going to be setting up a box in Louisburgh where you'll be able to drop off your squares, and I'm going to post the details of that and where the box is going to be once I've finalised it on the Louisburgh Facebook page and also on my Handmade by Sharla page. In addition, obviously, it would be great to meet as many people as possible who've made squares and discuss the project. So I'm looking at setting up several socially distanced coffee meetings during July where we can sit somewhere nice, have a coffee, and if you want to come and join me, drop off your squares and discuss the pattern, then we can. And again, the details of that will go up on the pages when they've been finalised. Alternatively, you can private message me via my Handmade by Sharla Facebook page and we can arrange something different. Whichever way you choose to send the squares to me, can you please make sure you include your name and contact details so you can be credited in the final piece. I would prefer to receive all the squares by the end of July, so we have all the squares ready to put together. So I think that's it. If I think of anything else, I'll put a post on the Louisburgh Community TV Facebook page. As always, if you've got any questions or suggestions, please contact me on my Facebook page, Handmade by Sharla. And finally, I would like to say a big thank you to everyone who's watched and joined in with this knit along, for your photos and messages. It's been really, really great. So, until we meet, bye for now.